Hello and welcome back to Up an Octave. Today we are talking about empathy in podcasting. And we're also really briefly going to take a little side tangent to talk about how gross toddlers are, because I definitely have a spring/summer cold. So excuse how exceptionally wonderful I sound today. But without further ado, let's get into it. This is something that I think is so incredibly important, especially for people who are in the true crime space, people who have podcasts on slightly more taboo topics. I just think in general, the world needs a little bit more empathy, and I think that that extends into podcasting. So the first thing that I'll talk about with how to center empathy in some more difficult conversations that you're having is to always remember your why. And this is somewhere that I think people get into a little bit of trouble, especially with like the voyeuristic elements of true crime, is that it's easy to get caught up in the scandal and in the juicy details, if you will. But, having empathy is really remembering that these are people's real lives, that people were impacted and are still to this day impacted by what you are talking about. And it's one of those things where it's like, if a survivor or if a victim's family member or if someone who is a survivor of a different case heard the way that you're talking about this, would that be upsetting to them? Would that feel empowering to them? Centering the way that you report on understanding that human element, that these are more than just details, that this is not a fictional, thriller book. This is something that really happened to somebody. And so always centering your why, what is making you want to talk about these things? And I am a true crime girly. My first podcast had some true crime elements to it. I still am a faithful listener of true crime podcasts, but there are some that just kind of give you the ick. You know what I mean? There are some that you can tell are scandalous and sensationalized. And then there are others where I think, there's some studies that have been done basically, or studying about why women in particular or female identified people are interested in true crime. And for a lot of us, it's gaining information. It's how would I survive that? Because in a world where it's man versus bear, we're all picking the bear. And so I think that has some validity to it as your why, is because you want to, kind of provide that guidebook of this woman was really smart. She noticed this red flag and this is how she kept herself alive, or, those type of things. I also think that giving a voice to the voiceless is important and significant. And so if you are passionate about highlighting the victims or the people who we lost, I think that that's a great way to remember their legacy by putting more of the emphasis on who that person was rather than the person who killed them or assaulted them or whatever the crime may be. To me, that is so much more impactful than just being like, hey, Ted Bundy killed all these people. Ooh, Jeffrey Dahmer ate people. Like that, I don't know. That gets old and that gets really creepy. There's that subset of true crime where people are rocking like Jeffrey Dahmer merch. And that super, super icks me out, because this is not a character. This is not Hannibal Lecter. This is a real human being who did incredibly dastardly things. So just always remembering your why and using that to inform the way that you report so that it doesn't enter that voyeuristic territory. And, this topic goes beyond just like true crime. True crime is probably going to be the one that we pick on a little bit more today, just because it is such fertile ground for things to go sideways. But really in anything where there is a taboo surrounding what you're talking about, or it's someone's lived experience, those are places that especially acting with empathy is so critical and important. So, if you are talking with someone about a fertility journey or a cancer experience or grief or, anything that is difficult or things that are taboo, things that we don't talk about in, quote, polite conversation. These are things that are hard for people to talk about oftentimes. And they're also things that are hard for an audience to listen to. And I think that a huge part of empathy and, not being kind of gross is considering not only the way that the person who you're talking to, if you're interviewing, would feel listening to it, but also considering the way that your audience is going to feel listening to it. And I don't mean disrupting people and getting them kind of out of their head or, making them think about something by confronting them with new ideas. I'm more so talking about that feeling, that almost secondhand embarrassment that you get when something has not been handled well. It's, watching The Office and Michael being like weird toward Oscar. You're like, this is really uncomfortable for me to watch how poorly this is being handled. And so even just from a podcasting standpoint, if you are a podcaster who wants more listeners, reporting on your show with empathy is going to ensure that you don't give that secondhand office embarrassment to your listeners, which makes you more listenable and easier to spread. If you are going to be covering something on your show, no matter what type of show it is, making sure that you are on your P's and Q's with language is also something that's incredibly important. So if you are talking about sex work, making sure that you are using the term sex work. If you are talking about someone who is trans, making sure that you are using their correct pronouns and not dead naming them. If you are talking about any of those type of things, making sure that if it is an experience that is different from your own, that you understand that you are a guest in that space, and so you handle it as closely to the way that people who are within that demographic would want it to be handled. And I think that is somewhere that in true crime, we have like some victim blaming that can happen on certain shows. And I'm being very careful to like not name any shows, good or bad here, because these are all strictly my opinion. But I do have some that I can think of where I'm like, so because she was a sex worker, it was obvious that this would happen to her or something like that. And that's really, really uncomfortable. Because, and I could go on a tangent here. It's never about you. If you are victimized, it's always about the person who is looking to do something bad. It's never about the victim. Anyway, that's my little PSA. But, I think about that in terms of, again, if someone who is impacted by this listened, how would they feel? If you are talking about fertility and you're being flippant about, well, why didn't they just, eat exclusively from Whole Foods and do this $10,000 treatment, blah, 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 blah. Like, not everyone is Gwyneth Paltrow, okay? Like, not everyone has access to do those really incredibly expensive things. If someone was the victim of a crime and they were a sex worker, those two things do not equal out. Like, oh, well, obviously. Now, sure, things were probably handled differently because that person was a sex worker than if she was a politician's wife or something, right? Because of the way that we handle different classes in our culture and in many cultures. But in general, if someone is in any of those demographics, if someone is struggling with fertility and they hear, oh, well, just eat more kale. Like, screw you. What are you talking about? That's not helpful. If you really want to get into the science of those things and really talk with an expert about navigating fertility, not providing that just like, oh, well, you should just. And if you're doing like true crime reporting, not being like, oh, well, if she had just not been alone at night. I think anytime that you are reductive and just have a, well, obviously kind of attitude, I think that invalidates experiences, and you can't really know unless you're there. And even if you are there, you only know for yourself. And I think that that's true with so many things. But in general, you don't know how you would handle something. You don't know what would work for you and your situation. You don't know any of those details firsthand. And even then, it's not a one size fits all. So just remembering that and kind of giving that grace that even if you do have an experience with what you're talking about, it's just your experience, is going to help you be more empathetic towards people who that's not their experience. Maybe you did cure your fertility challenges by eating more kale, and that's freaking awesome. But for someone who maybe had cancer, or maybe that's just not going to work for them, they could eat all the kale in the world and that's not going to give them the baby that they're hoping for. And so being intentional about that awareness is going to help you kind of stay in those good graces and just be a better podcaster in general. Also, anytime that you can avoid any kind of sensationalism for any topic that you're talking about is huge. We are in an era of clickbait. We have been for a long time, really since the advent of YouTubers and YouTube culture. But, if you can do your part to just provide information without kind of giving the ooh that goes around it sometimes, that's going to help you be more empathetic as well. Again, remembering that people are really being impacted by these things. But, thinking about what people's realities are like. Is that speculation furthering solving something, or is that speculation just for shock value? If you are sitting there, Michelle McNamara style, here's what this cold case could have been, that hits a lot differently than just kind of blowing up the things that are already being speculated upon in a way that just feels like it's for your attention. Consider, why do you want attention? And that's again part of the knowing your why, is why are you passionate about this? In talking about this, do you want to destigmatize it? Do you want to raise awareness for survivors? Do you want to help change policies? Do you want to help change the way that policing is done? What is significant to you? Or if you are in not a true crime space, like I said, we're really going to pick on true crime today, but a lot of this can plug and play in any genre. Or if you are talking about menstrual health, why is that important to you? Do you want to help reduce the pink tax? Do you want to help change policies for something? What is making you want to talk about this? Consider that, and that'll also help you to not sensationalize, because you can get eyes and ears on what you're doing without being sensational to the point of just being clickbait. And something else that is really significant is navigating other cultures and beliefs and languages. I hear so often on podcasts, and I have been guilty of this myself, so I'm just going to out myself right here, of struggling with pronunciations and being I'm probably going to butcher this, but... And that we've talked so much on this show about self-confidence, about, how you show up. And every time that someone says, I'm probably going to butcher this, but here's this pronunciation of this word that is foreign to me, that is you being nervous that you're going to mess up and trying to get ahead of that and be well, before you can call me out on it, I'm calling myself out on it. And, there is some value to that, but I don't know, for me, especially for Western white folk, there's kind of almost a baked-in xenophobia that can come out to play there, that is just this well, obviously I wouldn't know how to say this word. That doing your due diligence, YouTube can be a great wealth of pronunciation videos and that kind of thing. That can be a really helpful way to make sure that you are saying it correctly. And then, giving a disclaimer, but without, I'm probably going to butcher this. Just be hey, I watched some videos on how to pronounce this. I'm going to do my best. If someone who does speak this language can correct me, I would happily receive that feedback. To me, that still takes the responsibility of I might get this wrong without making it as flippant as I'm going to butcher this. And that's something that I've done too when I've been nervous about getting something wrong. And it's something that I have continually tried to unpack and do better. And so I think if we can just kind of change our language, change the framework within which we see these kind of topics, that helps change the perspective on how you handle different languages and those types of things. And the same goes for, different practices, different beliefs. This also gets into, if you're doing like a paranormal podcast, there is so much sensationalism with like hoodoo and voodoo or indigenous practices, or, I feel like we've heard about indigenous burial grounds more than I can count, and talking about the reason that, okay, so come with me here. If you do believe in the paranormal, talking about that indigenous burial grounds wouldn't be haunted, spooky places inherently because that's how indigenous people are, but rather that it is because the spirits who would be at rest there are upset that the circumstances of their death were so horrific. Like, we don't talk about that enough. That it's not just like, ooh, folk magic because they're indigenous, or, ooh, people who were enslaved had magic. Like, if we really unpack what that is, a lot of those beliefs were self-protective. And a lot of why those things are the way they are is a very unkind and unpleasant history. And so I think remembering that, if you're in like the paranormal space, is equally important to consider the why of something. Okay, so if you're talking about a haunted place, why is it haunted? Oh, well, the enslaved people's quarters are always really active. Gee, I wonder why. So thinking of it that way, instead of kind of the sensationalism of just like, ooh, and this part's the scary part, and I love paranormal stuff. Like that's my sweet spot. But considering what the life of the person who is now the ghost, what that was like, is going to help you to honor the people who could be descendants or cultural descendants of that person's spirit. And just doing your best. I think that goes a really, really long way too. I mentioned not being like, I'm going to butcher this, but owning up and acknowledging that you're going to get it wrong. Being humble and being legitimately willing to receive feedback. Being like, hey, I researched this. And also, P.S., do research it. Like, do your best to do a good job, right? Show up as best you can. This is not for a grade. This is a passion project. So do it well, But say, hey, if someone from this culture knows better than me, I still have a lot of questions and I would be honored to learn anything, but also don't put the emotional burden on people to do the work for you. But just say like, hey, like this is what I was able to find. Cite your sources. And, if I got it wrong, definitely let me know. And like I mentioned, research, find different sources. If you can find sources that are straight from that experience, whether it's a culture, whether it's a geographic location, whether it's a medical condition, whatever that is, if you can hear in someone's own words what their experience is like, that is such a valid perspective and such an important perspective to get instead of just like the Wikipedia breakdown of something. So do your research, and also especially do your research before interviewing someone who is of a different background or who is living through an experience that you're talking about. Ask them off the air, are you comfortable talking about this? Are you not comfortable talking about something? Give them kind of a rundown. These are the questions that I kind of want to get into. Do these feel okay for you? And give people the opportunity to say no. When I do my Pass the Mic series, that is always something that I just kind of touch base really quick. I don't typically get too deep on this show, but just making sure that I understand what kind of conversations we're having. And the two biggest examples that I can think of were pretty recently having Shelby Forsythia. We talked a lot about grief, which can be a touchy and tough subject. We talked about the loss of her mom. And, I just kind of touched base with her ahead of time. I was just like, hey, are we cool to get into this? And then before that, having Chloe Corcoran on as a trans woman, I was just like, hey, is there anything that you're not comfortable talking about? She gave me a couple things and I was like, yep. So, having some of those boundaries, allowing your guests to have some of those boundaries is a wonderful way that you can extend that empathy to them. And, not putting them on the spot, not pulling like an Ellen DeGeneres and Mariah Carey moment is huge. And also, another way that you can extend empathy is offering for them to hear the episode before it goes out and, giving them a chance to request any changes that they would like to make. If they're like, I actually don't love that I talked about this, or I don't love the way that I handled that. Could that part come out? Giving them some say in your editing process is also going to extend that empathy to them. And just be kind. Like it's that simple in a lot of ways, is just to be kind, to be compassionate, to put yourself in that person's shoes. That is so much of what empathy is. Like if you just have that outlook, that will get you at least half the way there. So I'm going to go ahead and go because my voice is killing me. But I will be back next week busting some podcasting myths. In the meantime, you can find me on Instagram at Sonivia Studios, where I share more podcasting tips and tricks and just kind of hold a space for you to commiserate. If you have any questions, you can fire them away over there. But other than that, I will see you next week. Thank you so much for helping me take podcasting up an octave.